everyone, welcome to Q&A, question and answers, where I get such good questions from such good people, and then I try and share just a little bit with you about it. This week's question ties in with something that someone had asked me recently, and so I decided to put them all together. I try to take all the questions that you send, and I do my best to try and see how they can all fit together. Somebody pointed out that this longest church season of the Christian year is called different things by different people. And so what this is going to require, I think, is laying just a little bit of groundwork. First of all, if you know people belong to churches that don't have what we call liturgical year, they, for some reason, the groups they're with decided that it was unnecessary, so they just got rid of it. For Christians of 2,000 years heritage and tradition, we have found it to be necessary for a number of reasons, because we look at the natural calendar of the secular year and we see that we have 4 seasons. We have spring, summer, fall, and winter, and you know that. And moreover, if you're a liturgical Christian, you also know that we have special days in each of those seasons called the Ember Days. I've talked about those before, and I'm not going to talk about them today. But the next point is, are there special things that take place in the church calendar that we commemorate every year? Yes. In fact, I think most people would say that the 2 most dramatic feast days in the church calendar probably would be, let's say, Easter and Christmas. It's a little more complex than that, but let's go with that for now. Easter and Christmas. And so it might be interesting to look at some of the other ones for a moment. What is the first season of the church year? You see, you understand that the secular calendar is different from the church calendar. And once upon a time, the church calendar was the calendar. But the secular calendar changed things around a bit. And so the very first season of the church year is called Advent. The next season of the church year is usually called Christmas. And as you know, Christmas is a season, not a day. And it goes on until Epiphany. Then what we have is that season that is entered into that is kind of green. Keep it, look at this. Advent is typically a bluish purple. Christmas is typically white or gold. Just like you see leaves changing or things happening in the regular year, those changes take place in the church calendar too. And then we see Epiphany, and there's a couple of major feast days in there that we oftentimes say Epiphany. Some point out it's the baptism of Jesus. Some talk about the theophany, which happens at the baptism of Jesus, whatever. But then those Sundays after that are green. And oftentimes people will call it Epiphany time or something along that line. The next season we come into is sometimes called pre-Lent. And for those who keep that calendar, it means that it has what we call the Gesimus Sundays in it. And that would be Septuagesima, Sexagesima, Quinquagesima. For others who have abolished that season, then it goes immediately into the Lenten season, which begins with Ash Wednesday, and it's usually a reddish purple rather than a bluish purple. Then, of course, we get into the Easter season. And you know that it's not a day, it's a season. And you know that we've just passed over Holy Week, but you know about all of those. Getting into the Easter season, and we know that it's 50 days long, which is pretty exciting, isn't it? And it culminates with a great feast called the Feast of Pentecost. On the 40th day, Ascension, 50th day is Pentecost. And some people in liturgical calendars said, since that's the birthday of the church, namely Pentecost, when the energy was given, then that ought to be the day when we do our counting. So let's count all of our days after the birthday of the church. The Sunday after Pentecost Sunday, Pentecost is the color red, is Trinity Sunday. Trinity Sunday, one Sunday later, the color is white. And then for those who keep a counting system after Trinity Sunday, the season is green. So what you see are two longer green seasons. I paused for a moment because I had to think the best way to tell you it's not the same each year in terms of the number of days, because it really partly depends upon when Easter is, because Easter can be early, Easter can be late. So that determines how long that longest season of late spring, summer, and autumn happen to be. And then we're back to Advent again. Well, counting is counting, isn't it? And what that means is that you should not be surprised that people have used different calendars over the years. In fact, if you look very carefully, you'll discover some churches use something other than the calendar that most of the people use. Not to bore you with it, but look up Julian calendars and Gregorian candles and so on. Remember, a lot of our calendars were designed to try and figure out what to do with not having a precise number of days in a month. And you know how to figure that one out now. The way we handle that is, ready? 30 days, half September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except February. It only has 28, and on leap year, 29. You got it. You can even say it. So you see, we've had different ways of handling the secular calendar, but we've also had different ways of handling the church calendar. You know that the three largest communions, and that means mega denominations, because the three largest communions are not denominations. There are denominations, though, that have sprung up at a later time, and they're wonderful groups of Christian people. But the three largest communions are, number one, the Roman Communion. Number two, the Orthodox Communion. Number three, the Anglican Communion. Now, within each one of those communions happen to be a variety of usages, a variety of rites. Don't trouble yourself with it. But generally speaking, for a very long period of time in the Western Church, and if you were part of the Roman Communion and the Anglican Communion, that's Western Church. And if you are in the Orthodox Communion, that's what we call the Eastern Church. But again, I'm not going to confuse you with the various rites that exist in all of those communions, which sometimes look a little bit different from the others. Well, generally speaking, we have the Trinity season. That meant that our counting happened after Trinity Sunday. There are a number of people in the Western Church who have some really good reasons and answers. Some say that it was tied up with the fact that St. Thomas Becket, remember the famous Archbishop of Canterbury who was murdered in the cathedral, T.S. Eliot, if you want to catch up on the marvelous play that he did, but that he was concerned that people were forgetting all about the Holy Trinity. And he was concerned that people were forgetting the heresies that were associated with the Holy Trinity. And so some believe that he really pressed the idea of the numbering after Trinity Sunday. There are other stories, there are even legends about it too. But that's one that at least you can think about. Where there were others who said, no, but see, Trinity, Holy Trinity, that's a doctrine rather than an event. And they said, well, you know, all of the other seasons are kind of tied up with themes. And since Pentecost is a theme, it's an event, of course. It's not a doctrine, it's an event. But it sets the theme. Then it was decided by some that they would do all of their counting after Pentecost. Well, now let's put those on hold because that's the Western Church. And while not always the same in all places at all times, nonetheless there were liturgical seasons, just sometimes different counting, different names. Eastern churches, that would be the Orthodox communion. Well, not quite the same. Most of their seasons revolve more around very specific, important holy days. And so if you look that up, or if you know something about Orthodox Christianity, you'll discover that some of these seasons talk about fasting. They talk about particular holy days that we look carefully at. And you'll notice that they are not seasons which line up, at least in terms of name, with all the seasons that are in the Western Church calendar. Of course, what that means is there's always going to be somebody saying, we're right, you're wrong. Have a good day with that one. That's just not the way this works. There are different ways of being able to set up the seasons. So there will be people who will therefore say, but wait a minute, Bishop, I remember when it was always counted after Trinity. So why this change where it started be counting after Pentecost? That's a good question. There was, in fact, in the beginnings of the 1950s, 1960s, a whole new liturgical renewal that was taking place in Western Christianity. Most of that liturgical renewal was taking place in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that didn't mean that it was going to have an effect on some of the rites within the Roman communion, because the one that you're most accustomed to would be called the Latin rite. But there are other rites within the Roman communion. And their kind of liturgical renewal was really very different from what most of you who are Roman Catholics remember in the 60s and the 70s. You, if you were Roman Catholic then, remember the Mass being in Latin. And you remember that suddenly some English, or I should say vernacular, maybe you were living in another country at that time, the language of the people started coming into that liturgical renewal. Then you'll remember that parts of the Mass started changing, and then perhaps you'll remember that the seasons were called something a little different, or they were counted differently, so that what we call pre-Lent, the adjustments, were removed by many of those who were engaged in liturgical renewal. So that by the time the new Roman Catholic Missal and books came out, and by the time that the new books came out in Anglicanism and in some parts of Lutheranism, many of them decided to all join together and start doing all the counting after Pentecost. Some decided not to. But that means that those who were accustomed to the Trinity counting found it to be just a little bit interesting that they were now having more emphasis placed on another season. They found it interesting, and it wasn't always explained. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. But if you look carefully, particularly in the Roman Rite, in the Roman Catholic Church, another phrase came into the counting where it began being known as ordinary time. And the term ordinary time was applied to those green seasons, such as the so-called Epiphany season and the so-called Trinity season. I'm saying so-called because not everybody had done it exactly the same way. And so on one hand, one might be able to say ordinary in what sense? Well, in the Latin it might make sense. In English, maybe not so much. And that's because, as you and I both know, in the church there's nothing that's really ordinary. Everything's extraordinary because it's all about God. But don't be hard on people when certain languages like Latin can't be translated into English, always conveying the same sense that we use in our everyday speaking. So that is, of course, a phrase that is used, but it doesn't necessarily address the question of counting. So I'll take you back to that. In some parts of the Western tradition, and particularly with the Book of Common Prayer, you have to remember that that meant people actually had a prayer book in their hands, and they had everything in there. And not everybody in the Western church had the whole books, because if all the books were put together, it'd be about this thick. It was expensive and difficult to carry. So many people would just have little booklets in their pews called missalettes or other names that they may have given to it. And maybe it would say what season it was and what the number was. But in the books of common prayer, which were handed down and held on to, it would tell you the first Sunday after, the second Sunday after, the third Sunday before. And pretty much it was right there, written. You could look at your calendar and figure it out. You just knew that there were more Sundays sometimes in Epiphany than others, and more Sundays in the Trinity season than others. But with liturgical renewal, a couple new things happened. In addition to looking at the names of those seasons, there was a whole counting situation that would be called, quote, propers. So that meant that if you looked at your calendar and you saw that today proper 2 was being used, you go into whatever book you were using and you would find out on proper 2 what the readings were for that particular Sunday. In some lectionaries, it meant you would see what the Old Testament lesson was, the psalm called responsorial psalm, the epistle, and the gospel. Some continued with the Western usage of having only the epistle and the gospel. But the difference now was, unlike times past where you had the same epistle and gospel on the same Sunday every year, the agreed upon lectionary that the Roman Catholic Church, Anglicans for the most part, and many Lutherans went with was that you suddenly had a time now where all of these folks were being able to hear, let's say, the same gospel on Sundays. So if you sat down and you were a Roman Catholic and your Anglican friend was at lunch with you and your Lutheran friend was with you, you probably could talk about the sermon or the gospel, and it would be the same gospel. Well, that didn't last too long, and sadly, with some other changes, another lectionary came out, and then another one, and by and large, we are back to an age where many people have the same readings, but not everybody has the same readings, and it's occasionally confusing for people. But don't worry about that. What really matters here is not to worry so much about the mechanics behind all this, but to notice that one of the blessings you have if you are a member of a liturgical church, and that would be the 3 main communions plus Lutheranism, which is not a communion, but it is a worldwide federation of different types of Lutherans that are liturgical, generally speaking. You would discover that there are these different readings, and the way this works out is that if I decide I want to preach a sermon on a particular topic this coming Sunday, I better look and see what the readings are first to see, does it fit? Or should I preach this sermon on a different Sunday? Liturgical calendars in liturgical churches prevent the priest from becoming a 3-sermon reality. And what I mean by that is he basically has 3 themes embedded in his head, and so those are the 3 just reworks regularly, and you get to hear the same 3 points just in different ways. Or what occasionally happens, and I have to defend priests a little bit on this one, and this is when people all go to the church on Sunday, and they hear a sermon based on the gospel, and some angry person walks up and says, "Why did you preach that sermon about me? What I told you was in confidence." Well, I have to defend the priest here. Those things which people are engaged in today, people during Bible times also were engaged in sin or problems or difficulties. There are very few priests who ever preach a sermon that was intended for 1 or 2 people. But it should be that the sermons engage all of us across the board, And maybe some sermons engage us a little more on certain occasions because that's where we are spiritually that Sunday, or maybe we've had the problem and that problem was addressed. So that means some people go away saying, that sermon didn't speak to me at all. And the person standing next said, you gotta be kidding me. Everything he talked about sounded like he was looking into my house this week. It just depends. You've heard me say this, that sermons are designed to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. But if we get to choose, that is, a priest, in my case bishop, get to choose whatever they feel like preaching about on Sundays, it becomes confusing. I mean, it really does. Look carefully at what the readings are during this longest season, whether you count it after Trinity or after Pentecost, and you'll see so much of it has to do with our Lord's earthly ministry. And we need to know about that. In fact, right now, for many of us, we've been hearing a lot of parables that Jesus told that relate to our daily lives, most remarkably. But you do know in this particular season, and I'm speaking to you right now at the beginning of October in the year 2020, but think about this, when it gets to be the end of this season and it's Advent, we're not going to be talking about Jesus' earthly ministry. See, it goes in this whole new theme. It's the new year. It also is all the readings that lead up to the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. So Advent is getting us ready for when Jesus is born. Now, of course, there are themes for each of those Sundays, too, and they deal very specifically with death, heaven, hell, and so on. But then we get into the Christmas season, and that's all about the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. And every one of those marvelous 12 days is a theme which leads us up to what most of us call Epiphany, some Theophany. And now we have the season. And that season deals with what happens after the wise men have arrived. Well, we go through a season of looking through that, but then the next thing you know, another preparation season. Whoops. You people better get ready because the second coming. Now, while we're supposed to talk in Advent about the first coming and the second coming, in Lent, now we're really getting ready. In fact, for Western Christians, that means ashes on the forehead. And it means then fasting and praying and getting ready for when all those great events of Holy Week take place, with their own particular colors, I might add, which varies from age to age, I should say in all fairness. But then we get, once again, as I said, into the great, what they call the Queen of Feasts, or the Feast of Feasts, namely Easter. And then we celebrate those marvelous days, coming to an end with Ascension, and then culminating, as it were, in Pentecost with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, where everybody gets to hear in their own language what had happened in Jerusalem since the last time the Jews had been there. And then we get into that season where I started you off with, namely, let's look at the public ministry of Jesus. So in the end, if you keep a liturgical calendar, you get to be able to look at the whole life of Christ, not just a segment of it. And you are able to focus on elements of his life that you don't want to miss out on. So the purpose of the liturgical calendar is that we might be able to have seasonal changes, just like we have in the secular calendar with seasonal changes. The way I was brought up, it not only meant that the colors changed for each season, and but in most of the churches I've served, the music changed dramatically too. So the liturgical music that we used in Advent would be very different from Christmas, very different from Epiphany. In one parish in which I served, we had 6 mass settings that the choir and the people sang. What that meant, you could tell which season it was simply by which holy, holy, holy they were singing, or which glory be to God on high they were singing, or which O Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, was being sung. That way, people walked in, they saw something different, they heard something different, and in my parishes, and growing up, that also, and in my ministry, it meant smells different. It means that there was a different type of incense to go with every one of those seasons. As you probably guess, it was a little more flowery during the Easter season, and a little more frankincense oriented in the Christmas and Epiphany season. Does that make sense? I think so. So, we are people with five senses, and the liturgical calendar and the various things that happen with the liturgical calendar help us understand what the season is. Help me out here for a second. Think about, well, I mean, if you live in certain parts of the country right now, sorry about that, folks. Yeah, there's probably some snow you're seeing, and my deepest apologies. Some of you are seeing some color changes right now because you're watching the leaves turning all these beautiful colors, and others are living places where I think the leaves don't change colors. They just get tired sometime in November, December, and they just fall off. Doesn't matter. Nonetheless, you can think about different colors that you get to see for the natural calendar. Let's try it out. Just for fun, what are the colors or colors you think about in spring? What are the colors you think about in winter? What are the colors you think about in autumn? What are the colors you think about in summer? Think about them all. Different colors, right? And sometimes different fragrances. And, whoa, always different music, right? So in the natural calendar, the secular calendar, all those things that we do in the older usage of having a liturgical calendar take place. And they have variety. Now, some people tell me they get bored living in a climate that doesn't change at all. I leave that up to you. You know, maybe some people don't get bored. But most of us don't mind some of the changes that will help us focus more on Jesus. And you see, here's the thing I want you to remember. All of this is designed so that you can get closer to Jesus. Most of the things that cause conflict, I'm afraid, are what I like to call the stuff part. The stuff part. You know, sometimes people say, hey, you wore the wrong color purple. Remember, my grandmother gave that other purple set. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's the stuff part. But if you get to the religious part of it, not the churchianity side, but the Christianity side of things, there is a reason for this. In fact, I could go so far as to say to you, Jesus is the reason for all the seasons. How's that? He is the reason for all the seasons. Because in every one of those gorgeous and spectacular seasons of the church year, all he's saying to you is, would you come closer? I want to embrace you. The other day, I was corresponding with a bishop, which happens daily actually, but different bishops every day. And he had said to me something that some are saying. He said, happy Corona time. Well, I'm not going to go there with you, but you know, we do have those tides in our celebrations. Like we have Easter tides, and we have Trinity tide, and that's what I still call, but we always called those, especially in the Anglican communion, the English tradition. Corona tide, now that's a stretch because I'm not aware of any celebration going on there. But do you know something? The church seasons are perfect antidotes to Corona time. Because if you will enter in to what Jesus is trying to tell you in each and every one of those seasons, can you hear it? He's saying, come unto me, all you that travail and are heavy laden, and I will refresh you. He's saying, take the yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But you see, beloved, if you carry around all the things you're upset about, your angers, your frustrations, your fears, your anxieties, the grudges that people sometimes hold, the memories that they won't ever let go of, see, those are the burdens. Those are the burdens that make it impossible for us to carry the load. But if you give it to Jesus, Jesus will fit a yoke for you so that you won't just be using this part of yourself, but your shoulders too. Yeah, but Jesus takes it on, not you. It's Jesus who takes on the burden and the load because he said so. So finally, I want to tell you something in conclusion, because I hope this leads you to understand it. It's the way we count, it's the way we keep track of things all these seasons. It's the way we change our hearts and our minds. It's fun to be able to look at all the differences. But when you turn over all your problems and your fears and anxieties and everything else right now, do me a big favor. Please don't attach a bungee cord to it. Because when Jesus says that he wants you to give it to him, it doesn't mean that you have to take it back. Give it to Jesus today. And sit down and look at your secular calendar and highlight some of the holy days that the secular world keeps, like in the United States, Memorial Day, 4th of July, all of those feast days that are secular feast days. And then look at the church's feast days and come up with an answer. What is it? All these feast days in the church are designed to bring you closer to Jesus. And that, my friends, is what it's all about. So, thank you so much for that excellent question. Keep on sending in your Q&As, and you have good Q's. Your job is to pray that I have a few good A's. Thanks. God bless.